All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome to the X Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide toll-free, 800-610-7035. My email address is xzone@xzoneradiotv.com on all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV, and our main website where you can listen to the X Zone 24/7, 365, www.xzoneradiotv.com. My guest this hour is Professor Francis A. Boyle, and we're going to be talking to the professor who was at the University of Illinois about Professor Boyle drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which is the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for biological weapons convention. His books include Biowarfare and Terrorism. Now, recently, Professor Boyle said, different United States government agencies have a long history of doing allegedly defensive biological warfare research at labs in Liberia and Sierra Leone. This includes the CDC, which is now the point agency for managing Ebola spillover into the United States. Why is the Obama administration dispatching the elite 101st Airborne Division to Liberia when they have no medical training to provide medical treatment to dying Africans? How did Zaire, Ebola, get to West Africa from about 3,500 kilometers away from where it was first identified in 1976? Well, joining me now from the University of Illinois is Professor Francis Boyle. And Professor, welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Rob, and my best to your listening audience and everyone up there in Canada. My mother's family is French-Canadian, so always happy to speak with people up there.
Oh, we're happy that you could take time out of your busy schedule, sir, to join us. Ebola, the number one news story in Canada, the United States, and around the world. 2 people contracted Ebola from Mr. Duncan, the first person to bring Ebola into the United States from Africa. And now it seems that the entire scenario pertaining to the protection of nurses and medical staff and now the public is just non-existent. Where did we go wrong, sir? Well,
the problem here is with the CDC protocols for Ebola. And what they should be applying are the SARS protocol that you remember, the SARS crisis you had up there in Canada.
Yes, sir.
The acute respiratory syndrome. And it's obvious the CDC protocols do not work, and they're not going to work. And instead of publicly coming out and saying that, the CDC is just digging in its heels and saying, well, we're gonna try to improve our protocols that don't work. So all this is going to do is expose certainly U.S. healthcare workers to this Ebola, and now we see this one nurse flew from Dallas to Cleveland and back, exposing all those people, and she was running around in Cleveland for 5 days. But you people up in Canada have experience in dealing with SARS, and you did effectively deal with it. I can't say I followed that in detail, but I know Canada had a serious problem, and you dealt with it, and that's really what we need to be doing down here in the United States. And also, since I'm of French-Canadian ancestry, I think the Canadian Health Ministry and Minister must immediately institute the SARS protocol and not the CDC Ebola protocol. They must do this immediately.
Something that we just found out today during a congressional hearing, Professor Boyle, was that the nurse who flew from Dallas to Connecticut and back had called up the CDC and asked them the day before that she was confirmed to have Ebola if it was safe for her to travel, and the CDC gave their blessings.
That is correct, because the CDC is operating off their regular Ebola protocol, which, in my professional opinion, is not the corrective protocol that should be applied here. It's the SARS protocol. And again, I would encourage all the public health authorities there in Canada to immediately institute the SARS protocol that you did effectively develop to protect the health of the American people, and simply discard the CDC protocol. And in fact, I would not pay the least bit of attention at all to any advice the CDC is giving you. They're up to their eyeballs in covering up what's going on here.
Right.
I have documented proof that the Centers for Disease Control was doing biowarfare work for the Pentagon.
Let's talk about this when I come back from this.
Sierra Leone.
Let's talk about this when I come back from this 2-minute commercial break, please. Professor Boyle is our guest.
Sure.
We'll be back in 2 minutes. Don't go away. Explanation. Professor Francis Boyle is my special guest this hour. He is a professor at the University of Illinois, University of Illinois College of Law. And Professor Boyle drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which includes the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. His books include Biowarfare and Terrorism. Before we went to the break, Professor, you were saying that the U.S. has a connection with Sierra Leone when it comes to laboratories?
Well, not this United States alone. I mean, the Fort Detrick has been over there. They do biowarfare work. Tulane has been over there. They do biowarfare work. But I have documented evidence right here in front of me that the Center for Disease Control itself was doing biowarfare work for the Pentagon in Sierra Leone, ground zero for this, as no later than 1988, and probably a lab constructed before that. We know that the Pentagon and the USAID constructed a BSL-4 lab, Biosafety Lab 4 level, the highest level of containment possible, over in Kenema, Sierra Leone. And there they engaged in all this dual-use, offensive, defensive, biological weapons type of work. Indeed, the bio-warrior from Tulane, who was involved in this, and they do a lot of biowarfare work in Tulane, just like up there in Winnipeg in Canada they do. He announced that the work they were doing at these labs in West Africa, and there's a whole series of CDC, USAID labs over there in West Africa, was not there for either the screening or treatment of the West Africans themselves, but for the sake of pure science. What type of science do you do at a BSL-4 lab? It's this offensive, defensive, dual-use biowarfare work. We know for a fact that during the Reagan administration, they ordered the Center for Disease Control and American Type Culture Collection, which is a scientific institute, to ship 40 shipments of weapons-specific biological agents to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein, to be used for the purpose of weaponization to be used against Iran. I have the citations to that in my book, and this was also a subject of congressional hearings. So I have the citations in there. So CDC has been involved in biowarfare work for the United States government, for the Pentagon, offensive biowarfare work, going back at least to the Reagan administration that we know of. So I'm just saying the Canadian government cannot trust anything the CDC is telling them. You are going to have to convene a group of some of your top experts. You must not use any of these biological warfare experts at Winnipeg or McMaster or anywhere else, because they're up to their nose in it too. But outside, independent experts, geneticists, biologists, medical doctors who have never done any type of biological warfare work, they call it research, but it's biological warfare work for the United States government or Canada. And we know for a fact that the Canadian scientists were doing biowarfare work for the Pentagon under the Reagan administration back into the 1980s. So these people have to be completely excluded because they're implicated in all this. So you need to get outside independent experts who have never been involved and convene a committee and, in my opinion, act to protect the Canadian people now. I think the first thing would be to apply the SARS protocol that Canada successfully developed up there. Second, if anyone does show up in Canada that has symptoms, they should be immediately transferred to a BSL-4 hospital. I don't know if you have a BSL-4 hospital in Canada. We have 4 of them down here. Those are the only hospitals so far that have been able to safely and effectively treat the Ebola patients we have down here. And then third, I think Canada has to put a do not board on your computers up there, which you do have, for anyone whose flight originates from West Africa. I'm not talking about people going in, humanitarian relief workers going in, that's fine. But even there, the humanitarian relief workers have to understand if they go in, they have to undergo a quarantine for 42 days before they come back. And that, too, is the problem with the CDC protocol. Right now, the CDC protocol is saying, well, you only have to be quarantined for 21 days, and then you'll be all right. The WHO said this is wrong. Our quarantine is 42 days. So those are, I think, 3 steps that the SARS protocol, treatment in a BSL-4 hospital, and putting a hold on travel in to Canada, that can easily be done. Your equivalent of the Homeland Security down here has all that travel information on their computers, and they can simply put a DNB, what's known as a DNB down here on it, that these people are not allowed into the country. The screening that you see now at 5 U.S. airports, that's nothing more than public hand-holding. And the truth of the matter is, Rob, in my opinion, what is really being done here by the Obama administration, they know they have a total disaster on their hands here, but they are trying to manage it as a public relations matter as best as possible and keep it under control until the November 4 elections, where the Democrats, Obama and his people, could lose control of the U.S. House. The U.S. Senate. And that is why I believe, we're seeing the stalling and delaying and covering up and lying by CDC. I believe they are getting all of their talking points directly out of the White House on this. And this is exactly what happened on the Benghazi fiasco.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Over there in Benghazi. before the run-up to the last presidential election 2 years ago. They knew they had a disaster there. They put out fake, false talking points just to keep it under control until after the presidential election. It was supposed to be very close between Obama and Romney, but it turned out it was an Obama blowout. So, that would be my advice to the Canadian health authorities there. You need to have an emergency committee,
right.
An Ebola committee, to look into this immediately. And again, outside, independent health science experts who have never worked and done any biological warfare work for the United States government or the Canadian government. What is amazing down here is the news media is calling in all these people who did biowarfare work for the United States government to comment on as their experts. And for the most part, all of them are simply discounting the dangers involved here, because that's their job. They're not going to get out there and tell the truth. And some of them have been up to their eyeballs in this type of work. So of course they're not going to level with the American people.
And it's funny because the administration keeps on talking about its transparency. By the way, Professor, the only biolab that we were able to find here that is a level BSL 4 is in Winnipeg. And it cost the Canadian taxpayers $175 million, and it's only one of 15 in the world. I had an idea. Why don't we just stop the people from coming into the United States and into Canada until they have gone through a precautionary 21-day quarantine before leaving Africa? So I decided what I would do.
Well, that's correct.
Yeah, what I did as a good Canadian, I decided...
Rob, let me correct you there one point, though. You see, you are operating in good faith off the completely erroneous CDC protocol. Because the WHO put out a statement yesterday that I read, you can find on their website,
right,
indirectly criticizing the CDC and saying, no, 21 days is not the correct period. The WHO period for a quarantine is 42 days, and that would only, even if you did a quarantine for 42 days, that would only pick up 98% of the cases.
Wow.
So everyone, the CDC is running around saying 21 days, and they know full well the WHO is saying 42 days, and they just don't care. And that's why Canada cannot rely on anything the CDC is saying.
It's unreal. It seems that there's more to this than meets the eye. I think that this is all something to do with the upcoming elections. I can't understand why President Obama has not come up front and taken control of the situation himself. If anything, this is doing him and his party more harm than good.
Well, the truth is, Rob, I think the real truth came out as to what is really going on here behind the scenes. It would be a total disaster for Obama and the Democrats between now and November 4. And that's why they're lying. They're covering up. They're dissembling. The meeting yesterday Obama had at the White House with his cabinet, that was just a photo opportunity to try to convince people it's under control.
Right.
When I think people have enough common sense to realize it's totally out of control.
Professor, you and I have to take a quick break.
If you look at the news media, look at the news media commentators, they're all following. They have talking points from the CDC. Sure. They're just repeating what the CDC is saying.
All right, Professor, stand by. I have to take a news break. We'll be right back. Great interview with a great gentleman. Professor Francis Boyle is our guest, and we'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Exonation, Professor Francis Boyle is our guest. He is a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law. He drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which is the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. His books include Biowarfare and Terrorism. And this is a question that Professor Boyle asked. Why is the CDC not better prepared for this emergency after the United States government has spent somewhere in the area of $70 billion after the October 2001 anthrax attacks to prepare for this exact contingency? It is clear that those anthrax attacks originated from the United States government sources. My question is to you, Professor, since you are undoubtedly one of the leading legal minds in the United States today. When it comes to President Obama and his authority, can he actually do what he's doing in Africa using American military?
Well, this is extremely dangerous, what he has done to the U.S. military forces. We have no idea precisely what this Ebola is that has come out of West Africa. It very well could have involved a genetically modified organism that was done there at the BSL-4 facility in Kenema, that the CDC, and by the way, Fort Detrick, which manufactures all of our biological weapons, still are involved in. So we could be dealing here with a genetically modified organism affixed to Ebola to make it even more dangerous than it was. All previous Ebola outbreaks have been contained soon, and the fatality rate for all of them before this, going back to when Ebola was first discovered in 1976, was 50%. Now, finally, the WHO came clean and said the fatality rate over there is 70%. And it is not under control. Indeed, it is totally out of control. So my concern here is that what we are dealing with is a GMO'd Ebola that came out of Kenema and perhaps some of those other CDC labs. And Obama is sending 4,000 U.S. military forces directly in there, and we have no idea what we're dealing with. And in addition, I just sent you National Public Radio announced that Obama says he's going to mobilize U.S. military reserves to send over to West Africa. I would certainly, in the strongest terms possible, tell the Canadian government that under no circumstances must you send Canadian armed forces to West Africa. Not until we have a basic understanding of what we are dealing with. Has this Ebola been GMO'd at Kenema or any of these other CDC facilities? Has it been weaponized by Fort Detrick? I don't have an answer to those questions, but I do know this type of work has been done. And indeed, I believe it's being done up there in Winnipeg. This Dr. Kawaoka from the University of Wisconsin, he is notorious. If you do a Google search on him, he resurrected the Spanish flu virus for the Pentagon, for obviously weapons purposes. He has also done gain of function research, that is, jumping trans-species, for example, from animals to humans, or one animal to another, but the implication's quite clear, that involves GMO. And he has also worked on Ebola, including a reverse genetic system for generating the virus, which is a polite way to say weaponizing it. Well, when the whistle was blown on this work down here in the United States, he moved it all up to Winnipeg to the BSL-4 facility there,
Right.
because he only had a BSL-3 facility down here at the University of Wisconsin. So you put together the Spanish flu virus, which he did for the Pentagon, these enhancement GMOs, and weaponizing Ebola, and it's all right there. So we know for a fact that at least one scientist was doing this type of work, first at the University of Wisconsin, and then this report I have here is 2007, up at Winnipeg. And I guess, one could only conclude they might have been doing it over there at that Enema facility, because, again, we know that Fort Detrick was over there. And Fort Detrick does offensive biological warfare work, claiming it is being done for defensive purposes, which gets back to the $70 billion. And in fact, I just got the new figures. Here in the United States, we have spent $79 billion since October 11, 2001, allegedly researching biological agents that could be a threat to the American people, like Ebola, which is on the list. They've been working on Ebola since the 1980s, to protect the American people from these biological agents like Ebola. Well, you can see now in the United States that absolutely nothing has been done by anyone to protect the American people from Ebola. That is quite clear. So then it's clear what was going on with this $79 billion was to develop an offensive biological warfare industry, which we now have in the United States. We have close to 14,000 scientists doing biological warfare work. We have over, depending on how you count it, 300 BSL-3 labs, which are just short of BSL-4, that you could even do anthrax work in if you want. So it's clear we have here in America an offensive biological warfare industry. I can't say I've really followed it up there in Canada, but I know that they do this work at Winnipeg at the BSL-4, and I did lecture a few years ago at McMaster. I was the Bertrand Russell peace lecturer there, and they informed me that there were bio warriors there at McMaster that did this type of work as well. So that's what the $79 billion was going for. Not protecting the health of the American people, which is now very obvious to everyone who looks down here in America.
I watch the news, and something that has struck me, Professor, is that here in the northern part of Africa, you have ISIS. Down in the southern part, you have Ebola. Now, with all the Americans and Canadians that have been radicalized and are over there fighting, I would hate like hell to see ISIS get a hold of the Ebola strain and actually infect Canadians and Americans who are returning back to Canada and the United States, carrying this dreaded disease and using these returning radicalized fighters as walking biological weapons.
Well, with all due respect, Rob, the real threat here is the United States and Canada sending their military forces into the hot zone on West Africa. That's the real threat. I don't know, Ebola, ISIS, whatever they're doing over there, they seem to be pretty busy to me.
Yeah.
The real threat is us sending troops in there who are totally unprepared to do anything. And then second, healthcare workers going in, it does seem that Doctors Without Borders knows what they're doing. And even there, I think several of those MSF doctors have died from the Ebola. It might be 9 out of 16 or something like that. And that very well could be because the Ebola has been GMO'd. It's been weaponized. Right. It's been made airborne. Again, I don't have evidence that is correct, but we know the United States government does that type of work. So this fellow Kawaoka at Winnipeg, Wisconsin, Winnipeg is doing it. Fort Detrick has done that type of work in Fort Detrick itself.
Why do you think then? What is your theory on why American troops are actually going to Africa? If they don't know what they're doing, if they're not prepared, why send them into harm's way? I can't understand it.
Well, Rob, let me say, this has never bothered the United States financial elite, power elite who runs this country in the past. They have sent U.S. forces into Vietnam with Agent Orange there. Dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known to humanity, to be poisoned by dioxin, and it didn't bother them at all. Likewise, in Iraq, both wars, the Gulf War syndrome, where you had this toxic mix of biological weapons that we had given to Saddam Hussein, right. Chemical weapons that even the New York Times reported yesterday were given to Saddam Hussein by the United States and its NATO allies, and then depleted uranium munitions that the United States knew full well were radioactive and carcinogenic. So the United States government has never had any problem in sending United States armed forces into toxic, carcinogenic, deadly types of environments before. I hate to say it, there's a book called Home Front you can get on Amazon.com. Rick Anderson, Seattle reporter, award-winning, and I wrote a foreword to it on everything that was done to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. Deliberately, they knew exactly what they were doing on Agent Orange, and likewise in both Gulf Wars, the Pentagon knew full well that they were exposing U.S. armed forces to all these environmental toxic dangers in Iraq twice in a row. So I know it sounds inhumane to you and to me, but not to the U.S. financial elite here, and I take it the Canadian financial elite, because for the most part it is not their children going into these hot zones.
God bless the veterans who come back from the theaters that we've seen them come back from since Vietnam. We can't take care of them right. How in the name of the good God?
No, of course not. No,
how are we going to take care of the troops who, if by chance they contract Ebola, how are we going to take care of them?
Well, if you look at Agent Orange and the Gulf War syndrome, certainly when U.S. armed forces came back, the Pentagon just said that these problems don't exist.
Just like depleted.
That's all I can say. They just would not recognize. Just take a look at yesterday's New York Times on Iraq, where they did everything to lie and cover up the fact that U.S. soldiers were exposed to old chemical weapons left over from the Iraq-Iran war that we helped give Saddam Hussein. So they don't really care. And as for coming back, well, I regret to say they very well might not be coming back. They might get quarantined over there. And then, if the other point is, why are we sending 4,000 U.S. armed forces over there when there is no preventative vaccine, none, to Ebola? And indeed, the Pentagon allegedly has been working on a preventative vaccine for Ebola since the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and they still don't have it. And why don't they have it? Because they were never really interested in it. They were interested in using Ebola as a weapon. They spent billions of dollars. I said the figure going back since just 2001 is $79 billion. Now that's about twice what the United States government spent in constant dollars on the Manhattan Project to develop the nuclear bomb. Yeah. So they've spent enough money here, going back to Reagan. I don't have the figures on how much was spent from 1981 to 2001. You probably have to add another $5 billion on that figure I gave you, and that's a minimum figure. But they said they've been doing this ever since then. Of course, they haven't, because that's not what they're really up to. So we don't have an Ebola vaccine because they're not interested. It's not the newest media. The CDC is trying to say, well, you didn't give us enough money, or you cut back our funds. Well, that's ridiculous. Last year alone, the CDC, all biowarfare programs in America got about $6.9 billion. So they've had more than enough money for more than enough years.
All right, stand by, Professor. We've got to take our final break. We'll be back shortly. Don't go away. Exonation, Professor Francis Boyle is our very special guest. He is a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law, and this professor is the gentleman who drafted the U.S. Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which is the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. And his books include Biowarfare and Terrorism. First of all, Professor Boyle, I want to thank you ever so much, sir, for not only coming on the show tonight, but all the great work that you do. I've had a look at your biography and the work that you're doing. God bless you. Keep the great work up, and thank you.
Well, thanks. And, being of French-Canadian ancestry, I'm always happy to help out up there. My family comes from Montreal. Yeah. So my mother's family.
Well, we've got about 3 minutes before we have to say so long, Professor. Is it too late to turn everything around? Is there a sinister plot that is at hand? I remember having guests on the show telling me that there are like internment camps that have been constructed at various locations, remote locations throughout the United States. I've had people come on who work in industry saying that their industries were hired by the U.S. government to make hundreds of thousands of coffins. Now, at the time, I thought...
Well, I don't know about the coffins, but I do know the internment camps are there, right? We worked on that back in the 1980s with the sanctuary movement. And I did have a minister, he went down and checked them out. Now, I don't know anything about coffins. Yeah. I'm not saying this is a sinister plot, but what I would say is that it is not too late for Canada, because right now you do not have any Ebola case that we know about.
That's right.
And that's why I think the Canadian health authorities have to have an emergency meeting without anyone who's done any biological warfare work at all for the United States or Canada, and figure out what is the strategy here. And at a minimum, it's got to be that SARS protocol that you develop. Mm-hmm. Second, treatment should be at a BSL-4 facility, or I'm not a hospital. I don't know if you've got a BSL-4 hospital up there. If not, then invite in Doctors Without Borders, because they seem to know what they're doing. Indeed, it's so bad down here in the United States that the CDC has said they're inviting in Doctors Without Borders to set up an operations in Dallas. Yeah. Now think about that for a minute. Doctors Without Borders goes all around to third world countries and treats people. And effectively, CDC is admitting we can't do it. We're going to have to import them and stick them in Dallas to do it. So, and then third, you have everyone's itinerary there on your Homeland Security computers. And you're just going to have to deny boarding to anyone coming from West Africa or who has an itinerary from West Africa. That can easily be done with the programming flip of the switch to keep these people out. And indeed, on this point, one of the top biowarfare warriors here in the United States, who's up to his eyeballs in Ebola, a fellow named Giesbert, who works with Fort Detrick, and also down at Galveston that does all sorts of hideous biological warfare research. He said the exact same thing independently of me. He said, if you want to keep the Ebola out of the country, you're going to have to put a stop on the travel.
Professor,
so that would be my advice to the Canadian government.
Professor, once again, thank you very much, sir, for coming on the show tonight. I really appreciate it. If there's anything we can do for you, getting anything out to the international listeners, let me know. We'll get you right on. Take care of yourself, sir, and thank you once again.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Professor Francis Boyle has been my guest. I'll be back on the other side of the news. Don't go away.